shadows of history.
In October 1973, the world changed almost overnight. Gas stations ran dry, lines of cars stretched for miles. Governments urged citizens to conserve fuel, but this was more than an energy shortage. It was a geopolitical earthquake. When oil-producing nations imposed an embargo in response to Western support during the Arab-Israeli conflict, they did not just restrict supply, they exposed a vulnerability at the heart of the global economy. For decades, industrial growth had depended on cheap and stable oil flows. Suddenly, that assumption collapsed. Prices quadrupled within months. Markets panicked, political leaders scrambled. Yet behind the public shock and media frenzy, diplomatic channels were already moving. Quiet meetings, emergency calls, strategic calculations, these unfolded away from cameras. The oil crisis did not begin at the gas pump. It began in negotiation rooms few people ever saw. Oil had always been valuable, but in 1973 it became something else: leverage. Members of OPEC demonstrated that control over energy resources translated directly into political power. The embargo was not merely economic retaliation, it was strategic signaling. It sent a clear message that energy dependence could reshape alliances and influence foreign policy decisions. Western governments suddenly confronted a new reality. Economic strength did not guarantee energy security. Military power could not drill wells. Financial dominance could not pump crude from closed ports. As tankers halted and exports tightened, global markets reacted with fear. Yet even as rhetoric intensified publicly, diplomatic envoys sought compromise privately. The oil weapon was powerful, but it required calibration. Pushed too hard and global recession could damage producers as well. Too soft and the political message would fade. The crisis quickly evolved into a complex game of pressure and restraint. While newspapers highlighted shortages and rising prices, diplomacy operated in shadows. Meetings between Western officials and Middle Eastern leaders took place quietly, sometimes outside formal frameworks. Back-channel communications became essential tools. The United States engaged not only through official summits, but also through strategic intermediaries. European nations pursued parallel discussions, each protecting its own economic interests. The crisis demanded flexibility, public firmness paired with private negotiation. Leaders understood that escalation carried enormous risks. Oil revenues were vital to producing nations, while consuming nations faced domestic unrest. Every conversation carried weight. Every concession required calculation. Declassified documents later revealed how delicate these negotiations were. They were not dramatic conspiracies, but careful balancing acts. The public saw confrontation. The archives show negotiation. As oil prices surged, the consequences spread rapidly through global markets. Inflation soared, growth slowed. The term stagflation entered economic vocabulary. Policymakers faced a dilemma with no textbook solution: raise interest rates to control inflation or lower them to prevent deeper recession. Industries dependent on transportation struggled. Consumers faced higher costs of living. Confidence weakened. The oil crisis exposed structural weaknesses in industrial economies that had grown complacent during decades of expansion. Energy dependency was no longer abstract, it was measurable in unemployment rates and GDP contraction. The economic shock rippled beyond Western nations, affecting developing economies that relied on imported energy. The crisis revealed that oil was not just fuel, it was systemic infrastructure. The crisis altered global power balances. Oil-producing states accumulated unprecedented revenues, strengthening their political influence. Financial flows shifted. Western nations began recycling petrodollars through international banking systems, reshaping global finance. Energy exporters gained diplomatic leverage in international forums. Meanwhile, industrialized nations reassessed foreign policy priorities. Energy security became central to national strategy. Military alliances, trade agreements, and diplomatic engagements increasingly reflected oil considerations. The events of 1973 marked a turning point. Resource control had become a primary instrument of geopolitical strategy. Governments responded with structural reforms. The United States created the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Europe accelerated nuclear energy expansion. Japan pioneered efficiency technologies. Diversification became policy doctrine. The lesson was clear: dependence equals vulnerability. International coordination mechanisms strengthened. Energy forecasting became more sophisticated. Markets began pricing geopolitical risk into futures contracts. The crisis reshaped long-term planning across industries. It was not merely a reaction, it was transformation. The oil embargo did not merely disrupt fuel supplies, it destabilized the foundation of the global economic system. Within months, industrialized nations that had grown accustomed to cheap and abundant energy faced a historic anomaly: high inflation combined with economic stagnation. This phenomenon, later labeled stagflation, challenged established economic theory and exposed vulnerabilities that policymakers had long ignored. Manufacturing costs soared, transportation expenses multiplied, and consumer prices followed. Stock markets reacted with volatility, and confidence in financial institutions weakened. Governments struggled to respond: raise interest rates and risk recession, or maintain liquidity and fuel inflation further. The crisis revealed how deeply interconnected energy and economic stability truly were. It was no longer a question of market fluctuations, but of systemic fragility. Nations realized, perhaps too late, that dependence on a single strategic resource could shift power balances overnight. The 1973 oil shock transformed energy from a commodity into a geopolitical weapon with measurable economic consequences. In the aftermath of 1973, the world did not simply recover, it restructured itself. Energy policy became a matter of national security. The United States established the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to shield itself from future supply disruptions. European nations accelerated nuclear energy programs and invested heavily in North Sea exploration. Japan, almost entirely dependent on imported energy, pioneered efficiency technologies that reshaped industrial production. Governments realized that diversification was no longer optional, it was survival. International institutions strengthened coordination mechanisms, and global markets began pricing geopolitical risk directly into energy futures contracts. The balance of power had subtly shifted. Oil-producing states had demonstrated that control over resources translated into political leverage. Meanwhile, consuming nations adapted by building alliances, reserves, and contingency strategies. The post-1973 energy order was not built on trust, but on strategic calculation. Energy diplomacy became as critical as military deterrence. The crisis did not merely disrupt markets, it redefined global power structures for decades. Declassified archives reveal a more nuanced story than the headlines of 1973 ever suggested. There was no single mastermind orchestrating events from the shadows. Instead, there were layered negotiations, informal diplomatic channels, private assurances, and calculated compromises. Some discussions occurred in official summits, others unfolded quietly through back-channel diplomacy. The complexity of these negotiations rarely translated into public narratives. Media coverage focused on fuel shortages and rising prices, but the strategic bargaining behind closed doors remained largely invisible. It is in these unseen exchanges that the real dynamics of power become evident. Governments weighed national interests against global stability. Leaders balanced domestic political pressure with international obligations. The absence of full transparency later fueled speculation and conspiracy theories. Yet archival evidence suggests something more pragmatic: strategic actors responding to shifting incentives in real time. History is rarely shaped by a single secret agreement. It is forged in continuous negotiation, risk assessment, and power recalibration. The oil crisis of 1973 did not end when embargoes lifted. Its legacy shaped decades of policy, alliances, and economic planning. It transformed energy into a central axis of global strategy. Every subsequent conflict in oil-producing regions would be analyzed through the lens of 1973. Governments built reserves, diversified supply chains, and refined diplomatic strategies. Markets never again assumed energy stability as permanent. The crisis revealed a fundamental truth: Modern economies run not only on fuel, but on fragile interdependence. When one link tightens, the entire chain reacts. The events of 1973 were not an anomaly, they were a warning, a reminder that in geopolitics, resources are power, and power is negotiated. History often hides its most consequential decisions behind closed doors.